Laropoli, a small hill town in the toe of Italy, was founded by petty criminals. It was here that Francesco Costello was born on February 10, 1891. Francesco was the youngest of Luigi and Maria Costello's 6 children. He lived with his family in this house.
He always dreamt of the water that he drank in Italy, and drinking from the wells, and hearing the church bells ring. And that was part of him. That was just part of his makeup.
In 1895, Francesco took his mother's hand and crammed onto a passenger ship bound for New York, leaving a sister behind with relatives. He was 4 years old.
They kept him in that large pot that they cooked in all the way over on the boat. I mean, I'm sure they let him out to run around once or twice, but that was basically where he stayed.
The family settled in the East Harlem section of New York, a slum bursting with newly arrived Italian immigrants. Francesco's father struggled to run a small neighborhood grocery store. The boy came to despise his father for accepting their filthy conditions. He would wander the streets for hours, yearning to escape the family's poverty.
Costello always admitted that what he wanted was wealth and power and respectability, and I think you have to attribute that to some extent to the idea that he was always trying to escape that East Harlem ghetto.
Crime was the easiest and, as the young man later saw it, the only ticket out. He dropped out of the 5th grade, joined a street gang, and began robbing people. In his new profession, Francesco Costello adopted several aliases. One would eventually stick: Frank Costello, an Irish version of his name.
You could see that he was a very sullen, tough kid. And there really was no marked difference between the man who became known as the Prime Minister of the underworld and others. He was just another hoodlum kid.
A perfect candidate to collect rents for a local don. On one of his rounds, an aging beauty who was behind on her rent offered the 15-year-old something else in payment.
Costello wasn't willing to give up 2 months' salary for that, you know. So she started feeding him wine. And he says, as he was drinking the wine, her hair became longer and silkier, longer and silkier.
Costello lost his virginity, then failed to turn in the rent money. His boss beat him up, a painful lesson that became a metaphor in Frank's future business dealings.
He would send out a message after talking to the guy. He says, oh, her hair is getting longer and silkier. And everyone would know what it means. That, you know, I'm not going to go near this proposition if the world came to an end.
Several years later, when Costello was 23 years old, a friend introduced Frank to Loretta Geigerman. Bobby, as her friends called her, was a pretty brunette, outgoing and Jewish. She and Frank, a Catholic, fell in love. After a courtship of several months, on September 23, 1914, an Episcopal minister from St. Michael's Church married the couple in the Chapel of the Angels. Bobby was only 15 at the time. The honeymoon ended several months later when police arrested Frank for packing this gun. The judge sentenced him to a year in prison. It was a sobering experience for Costello. He vowed never to carry a pistol again. He would make his way through life by his brains, not by a gun. Just after World War I, Costello hit on his first business scheme, a toy novelty known as a punchboard. It was a craze sweeping New York at the time.
You just take a little needle and punch out a little piece of paper, and if you opened up the piece of paper and it said, sorry, you lost, it was too bad. If it said you won 25 cents, whoever gave you the punch bowl would have to give you the 25 cents.
Costello and a partner not only made the punch boards, but also the Cupid dolls that won as prizes. Within a year, they had earned $100,000. Then they tucked away their earnings and declared bankruptcy, bilking creditors for $14,000. Costello learned how to capitalize on more gambling schemes from a master, Arnold the Brain Rothstein. Rothstein ran a bookmaking empire and was New York's most powerful racketeer. The Brain protected his gambling empire through Tammany Hall, the democratic machine that controlled New York City government. Tammany Hall leaders decided who was made a district attorney, a police precinct captain, or a judge. Costello learned from Rothstein how to use money, not threats, to buy them all. Knowledge that came in handy when Prohibition took effect on January 16, 1920. Rothstein backed the bootlegging operations of Costello as well as those of several other young Turks. One was a savvy Italian kid from New York's Lower East Side named Charles Luciano. From the same neighborhood came two Jewish thugs, Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Siegel. But one of Luciano's close associates, Vito Genovese, was suspicious of all non-Italians and resented these Jewish colleagues. Vito once complained in front of Siegel and Lansky, "What are you trying to do? Load us with a bunch of Hebes?" Before Bugsy could flash his trademark temper, Costello stepped in. "Take it easy, Don Vitone. You're nothing but a foreigner yourself." Genovese did not say another word. Costello emerged as a bootlegging innovator. He was the first to use seaplanes to protect his liquor shipments from hijackers. And he was a shrewd organizer. From his headquarters at Lexington Avenue, Frank ran his rum-running operation like a Fortune 500 company, staffing different departments like distribution, bribery, and intelligence. Once, when he learned icy weather had wrecked one of his shipments, Costello remarked, "Too bad I can't buy off the icebergs." Only 34 years old, Costello was on his way to becoming a multimillionaire. Then the law finally cracked down. In December 1925, the New York Times announced the Coast Guard had smashed a $40 million liquor ring. 2 years later, in 1927, Costello's trial ended in a hung jury. "I hung it," Costello reportedly said. Later that year, Frank took Bobby and a friend to Laropoli, where he visited a sister who had stayed behind. Word of Costello's success in America had preceded him.
The whole town lined up. I mean, it was a very poor town. And here was this son of Laropoli coming back to make the town whole again, or rich again. And someone would come up and his sister would interpret. And she would say, "This woman, she has 4 children already, and a 5th is on the way. They have no money." He said, 3,000 lira. They want to rename the town after him. But he said, no, that'd be too much. He said it was a marvelous experience going back to the place where he was born and having the whole town indebted to him.
The boy who had left in a cooking pot had returned a wealthy man. His relatives had no idea Costello was about to play a crucial role in the rise of the American Mafia.
Organized crime operates on one supreme commandment. No one person is above the organization. The organization is always supreme.
There never was anything subtle about the way a mob performed a hit. Hits were meant to send messages.
They're never done accidentally. They're never done solely out of revenge. They're never done for any casual reason.
It's business. Nothing personal. Strictly business.
By the late 1920s, bootlegging had made Frank Costello rich. His money-making ability earned him respect from other mobsters. But it was as a peacemaker that transformed Costello into an underworld leader. He made his debut as a mafia diplomat at a major gathering of gangsters in Atlantic City in 1929. Costello had called them together for a specific reason. Just 3 months earlier, Al Capone's hitmen, disguised as Chicago police officers, had lined up members of a rival gang and mowed them down. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre had put the mob on the front page of newspapers across the country and provoked public outrage. Just the kind of thing gangsters wanted to avoid. It was Costello who delivered that message to Capone, politely but forcefully, telling Scarface he should go to jail until things cooled down. "Tell me when I'm supposed to laugh," Big Al replied. But he heeded Costello and arranged his own arrest on a minor gun charge. Costello's wisdom at the Atlantic City Convention earned him the sobriquet Prime Minister of the Underworld.
When he wanted to cause conflict, he could pit powerful enemies against each other, yet not be in the battle. When he wanted to end conflict, he could bring bitter enemies together as the mediator. And when he wanted to accomplish something, he could bring everyone together and convince them that it was in all of their interests and get big things done.
Costello's ability to get big things done soon extended to the upper world as well. When Arnold Rothstein was killed over a card game in November 1928, Costello inherited his political connections at Tammany Hall. Costello now became the bridge between the under and upper worlds. Costello's friend, Charlie Lucky Luciano, admired Frank's diplomatic skills. Frank became one of Lucky's most trusted advisors when Luciano organized a National Crime Commission in 1931. Lucky also set up his own crime family, with Costello as a senior aide. Though Frank played a crucial role in the newly organized mafia, he had his own money-making enterprise, which he kept separate: gambling. Costello and a partner put a slot machine in every candy store, small bar, and grocery store in the New York area, 5,000 in all. Costello also took over Rothstein's bookmaking empire. The bookie operation and slot machines were illegal, but the Prime Minister knew how to get around that formality.
What he needed was political protection. Tammany Hall, through its control of judges and the police, was able to give him that protection. What was Costello able to give Tammany Hall? In one word, money.
We got handed our envelope every month, what we used to call the pad. You know, guaranteed them life, liberty, and freedom.
Costello's influence rose above the police rank and file. Something made clear at the 1932 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. There, Costello shared a suite at the Drake Hotel with the leader of Tammany Hall, Jimmy Hines.
Can you imagine a gangland leader going to a presidential convention and sharing a suite of rooms with one of the most important political leaders in New York City? That was a sign of how close Costello was to the political establishment.
Hines introduced Costello to presidential nominee Franklin Roosevelt as a prominent New York businessman and major campaign contributor. The mob was hedging its political bets. While Costello and Hines were backing Roosevelt, Lucky Luciano was in another hotel suite, stumping for FDR's rival, Al Smith. When Jimmy Hines found out and complained to Costello, the Prime Minister calmly responded, "I never heard you complain about your salary."
That's how he had politicians and judges and district leaders who had police chiefs and cops and detectives. That's how he had the whole town in his pocket.
In very rare cases, Costello came across someone he could not corrupt. In 1934, crusading New York mayor Fiorello LaGuardia declared war on Costello's slot machines.
Let the gamblers, tin horns, racketeers, and gangsters take notice that they have to keep away from New York from now on.
It was a major economic blow to the self-proclaimed king of slots, until a Louisiana senator named Huey Long offered help. Costello had met the Louisiana Kingfish during a party at Frank's Long Island Country Club. Long was drunk.
Huey was in the men's room, and the only urinal was being used. So he try to fly between the guy's legs. His aim was not too good. They started to beat up on him pretty good.
Summoned by a bathroom attendant, Costello saved the senator in the nick of time. The two eventually became friends, a relationship that was about to pay off for Costello. The gangster and the senator stood arm in arm at the window of Long's New Orleans penthouse. Long invited Frank to bring his slot machines down south.
Frank is thinking to himself, he said to me, maybe I know something he doesn't want anybody to know. He's got his arm around me, but I put my arm around him. If I'm going out the window, he's going to go out with me. And Huey Long said, you see all that out there? Anywhere you see, whatever you want, you've got.
The slot machines were illegal, but the senator made sure no one touched Costello's. With the money from his gambling operations flowing in, Costello and Bobby moved into an expensive Manhattan apartment building, the Majestic, on Central Park West. The couple could not have any children. Bobby tolerated a mistress Frank kept named Thelma Martin, whom he put up in a Fifth Avenue apartment. Frank thought his mistress was playing around, so one day he bought a telescope and began peering across Central Park into her apartment.
He did it for about 20 minutes, and he suddenly said, what am I doing? And he stopped. He said that was the thing he was most ashamed of.
Another thing that embarrassed Costello was his voice.
When I met him, he had a funny voice. He had a voice that talked like that, you know what I mean? He said, "Oh, Tony, how are you?"
Costello's hoarse voice was the result of a botched operation to remove polyps on his throat. Frank joked, "I went with the wrong doctor." What he lacked in voice, Costello made up for in affability.
It's like Kipling's poems. He could walk with kings but not lose the common touch. He was just as good at a card table with 4 or 5 wise guys as he was with judges, politicians, a senator.
Frank's style could not have been more different than that of his rival within Lucky Luciano's crime family, Vito Genovese.
I was looking at him pretty hard when he turned his stare upon me, and he frightened the I mean, he caused me to really jump out of my skin. You knew just from looking into his eyes that he could destroy you without any regrets.
When Luciano went to prison in 1936 for running a prostitution ring, Genovese became acting boss. But just months later, Genovese was charged with murder. Vito fled to Italy, where he would spend the next decade. From his prison cell, Luciano now looked for the best man on the street to run his family. Luciano decided that man was Frank Costello.
I'm not sure he sought that job or that he wanted that job. Frankly, he was doing great without the headaches of being a boss.
Costello would soon find himself caught between his underworld responsibility and a personal quest for upper-world respectability. As boss of a powerful New York crime family, Frank Costello faced one of his biggest leadership tests in 1941. A hitman named Abe Kid Twist Rellis had turned stool pigeon, sending 4 mobsters to the electric chair. Plain and simple, Kid Twist had to go, but the cops were guarding him around the clock at the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island. Only one man had the power to eliminate Rellis.
Costello was the ultimate diplomat, the ultimate Machiavellian. He was the chess man who could move the pieces around the board so that everything would work out for everyone.
Everyone except for Kid Twist. On November 12, 1941, Rellis fell 6 stories to his death, earning him the epitaph, the canary who could sing but couldn't fly. The cops on duty claimed to have been asleep at the time, but Lucky Luciano later said Costello had paid them $50,000. Meyer Lansky said it was double that. After World War II, Costello and Lansky used their financial muscle to help transform a parched desert town called Las Vegas into a gambling mecca. The duo also controlled casinos in Havana and Miami. They branched into oil and real estate. Costello even invested in Wall Street property. With his business deals becoming more and more legitimate, Costello found being a crime family boss a burden.
He was not a boss who ran things every day. He really wasn't that interested in the rest of Cosa Nostra, and he basically let the family become a series of feudal barons, like before Louis XIV.
People came to him like people in the old days of France, when they would come before the king asking for a boon. Well, he didn't have a palace. He would be at the Waldorf Astoria.
Costello projected a regal image. He wore expensive tailor-made suits, would only smoke English Oval cigarettes, 2 to 3 packs a day.
I said, who do you think you are? What do you think you are? And he said, a sportsman.
He liked to live the kind of life that emulates old English money from the countryside. He tried to translate that into an urban gangster's existence in New York.
Something reflected in Costello's unwavering daily routine. He liked to call himself Mr. Schedule.
He got his own breakfast most of the time, and then he seemed to walk over to the Central Park Zoo to watch the animals being fed in the morning.
He went each day to the barber shop at the Waldorf to get a manicure and a trim. He had lunch each day somewhere in one of the finest Midtown restaurants, and then would go to the track.
He would then go to the Biltmore, where they had a very good steam room. We loved steam rooms.
Evenings would generally find him at one of his favorite restaurants. Late at night, in a sentimental mood, he might go to Monsignore, where he liked the strolling violinists. And then it was back to Central Park West.
At their country home in exclusive Sands Point, Long Island, Frank and Bobby would relax on weekends. There, Frank kept a horse and played golf at his country club. He hosted elaborate dinner parties, where he went around the room asking people's opinions on current events. He tried to use big words that clashed with his street dialect. Costello once said, "All I know, I stole. If I saw you hold a cigarette a certain way and I liked it, I would steal it from you."
He was very, very good at putting a veneer of civilization on the criminal empire. But, of course, beneath the veneer was still a reality.
He wasn't a killer. He was a corrupter. Corruptors change us. When judges are bought, when police chiefs are bought, when people in government are bought, it changes our system of government. And it is much more dangerous than Vito Genovese, who merely kills.
If ever wanted to play golf with a couple of guys, would be Frank's guests. Get treated like a king out there. Play on the arm, everything, want to drink, lunch, anything we wanted. Frank would have everything arranged for us. So you couldn't, now you're just turning your back on that kind of a life, right?
In 1943, Costello arranged for a judge named Thomas Aurelio to be nominated to the Supreme Court of New York. When Aurelio phoned Costello that night to profess his undying loyalty, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office was listening on a wiretap. Costello told Aurelio, "Listen, when I tell you something's in the bag, it's in the bag."
Every New Yorker understood when it came to politics that, yeah, okay, the game is rigged. You know, nothing is on the up and up. But I don't think that they had, even then, any idea how closely affiliated a mob boss, Frank Costello, was to the very strings in the puppet game of New York power.
They found out when the incident exploded onto the front pages. Aurelio was still elected to the Supreme Court, but Costello later complained, "I can't even get a parking ticket fixed with him." Costello's notoriety made him unwelcome in some circles. A former bootlegging partner, Joseph Kennedy, who became ambassador to Great Britain, turned his back on Frank. In 1947, plagued by depression and insomnia, Costello did something few, if any, mob figures ever did. He went to a psychiatrist.
He was depressed because despite all the wealth he had accumulated, all the power he had, he wasn't as respectable as he would have liked to be. You know, what could you say to someone like that? I don't envy the psychiatrist, because he really would have to tell him, if you want real respectability, get in another line of work.
Instead, the psychiatrist advised Costello to widen his social circle, to become friends with nice people. When Costello met Santha Rama Rao at a party on Long Island, the 24-year-old was just beginning a writing career.
I told some of my friends that I'd met this rather charming older man at a house party, and his name was Frank Costello. They were all, first of all, horrified. How could you make a date with Frank Costello? And the second question was, when do we get to meet him?
Rao introduced her friends to Costello at a cocktail party in his honor.
There was one friend of ours who was a stockbroker, and he was very disapproving. And Frank saw this look of disapproval on his face and asked him what he did for a living. Ben replied that he was a stockbroker, and Frank said, "Oh, then we're in the same business. We both gamble with other people's money." And from that moment on, I knew we were going to be friends.
The novelist and the mob boss often lunched together at the Waldorf.
He wanted in some way to make up for what his life had been. I had very strongly the feeling that he wanted a different kind of life from one that he'd led.
In mob terms, he was probably a little too nice a guy. Sooner or later, he was going to be pushed out of the way by somebody who was more violent.
That someone was Vito Genovese. In 1946, Genovese was extradited from Italy to face the murder charge he had fled. When prison guards found the star witness dead in his cell with enough poison in him to kill 8 horses, the charges were dropped and Vito was a free man. Slowly, he began to undermine Costello's power so that he could take over Luciano's crime family. In this emerging power struggle, Costello tried to show Vito how much influence he had in the upper world. He gave Genovese a seat of honor at an unusual function he hosted in 1949. Costello had been named vice chairman of a Salvation Army fundraising dinner. The Prime Minister hosted the $100 a plate event at the Copacabana Club he secretly owned. The guest list included 8 judges, several congressmen, and the Tammany Hall brass. Reporters got wind of the party and had a field day.
A newspaper account quoted one socialite as saying it was a marvelous affair. I've never met so many judges in my life.
As Costello's extraordinary political influence became evident to the press, he appeared on the covers of Time, Newsweek, and Collier's. He was called America's #1 mystery man. Costello was about to be forced into the harshest spotlight of his life, one that would unmask him in front of the entire country and thwart his dreams of gaining respectability.
solemnly swear the testimony you give this committee will be
Frank Costello's lifelong quest to gain the public's respect came to a final and humiliating end in 1951. He was subpoenaed to testify before Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver and his investigative committee. The committee was capping off a 14-city probe of organized crime, its final stop, New York City, and its most notorious witness, Prime Minister of the mob, Frank Costello. The senator's questions went all the way back to Frank's bootlegging days.
I bought liquor and sold it, but I didn't directly myself.
And when you did that, you broke the laws and flaunted the Constitution, did you not?
Well, I didn't call it that, yes.
You call it that?
Yes.
Do you realize, with me and all good citizens, that there can be no qualified allegiance to the Constitution of the United States?
Well, I wasn't the only one, sir.
I didn't ask you that. You're the only man I'm questioning now, sir.
Because Costello's attorney asked TV cameramen not to show his client's face, they focused on what became known as Costello's hand ballet.
You had picture after picture of Costello nervously crumpling a handkerchief in his hands, rubbing his sweaty palms together, combined with his very, very hoarse voice, seemingly coming from a disembodied Costello, led everybody to think, and I think quite properly, that the man was guilty as sin.
Have you always upheld the Constitution and the laws of your state and nation?
I believe I have.
Have you ever offered your services to any war effort of this country?
No.
Bearing in mind all that you have gained and received in wealth, what have you ever done for your country as a good citizen?
Paid my tax.
The 2-day barrage of questions drained Costello. Finally, he said he'd answer no more.
You refuse to testify further?
Absolutely. I'm not going to answer another question because I'm not under arrest and I'm going to walk out.
And he did. Costello was cited for contempt.
His worst fear was realized when he was unmasked for what he was. You know, a mafia leader in disguise, uptown.
The contempt charges got Costello an 18-month sentence. For the first time since 1915, he was going back to prison. The government was not finished. It moved to deport the 63-year-old Costello to Italy for lying on his naturalization papers. Then came tax evasion charges.
His lawyer, Ed Williams, told him that he was claiming to be old and sick, and, here he looked great in these well-tailored suits. And Williams supposedly said, get the suits made too big so you look like you're shrinking in them and you're not well. And he reportedly said, "Counselor, I'd rather blow the case."
He did. The court sentenced Costello to 5 years in prison and a $30,000 fine. He turned himself in to the U.S. Marshals on May 14, 1956.
How about your business affairs? Are you leaving them in charge of anyone?
I have no comments to make. I believe that's enough for the day. Huh?
Thanks.
Just 10 months later, Costello got out on appeal. His freedom would nearly cost him his life. Costello's longtime rival, Vito Genovese, wanted Costello dead so that he could take over the crime family.
Genovese was particularly enraged at the way everybody kept saying how Frank knew how to handle things, how he knew how to make money, how he kept things on an even keel. All these things just drove Genovese crazy. And that's when he ordered the hit on Costello.
May 2nd, 1957. Costello spent the evening at Monsignore Restaurant with his wife and friends. They included Phil Kennedy, who managed a modeling agency, and John and Cindy Miller. John was a gossip columnist for the National Enquirer. His wife was pregnant at the time, and Costello patted her stomach for good luck. Frank later became godfather to Cindy's second child, John Jr.
He did not want to go back to prison. He did not want to be sent back to Italy. He was intensely patriotic. Frank was very worried.
In what was becoming a new facet of his daily routine, Frank cut short his evening to go home and phone his lawyers. Frank shared a taxi with his friend Phil Kennedy around 11 p.m. As Costello's taxi pulled up to his apartment building, a hulking figure emerged from a limousine, rushed into the lobby, and waited. He was Vito Genovese's bodyguard and chauffeur, Vincent the Chin Gigante.
Vincent the Chin pointing straight at Costello with his arm stretched out like this, with a gun in his hand, says, "This is for you, Frank," and fires. He was 6 to 12 feet away. Costello staggers, blood flows from his head, and he starts to sink to the floor. Gigante runs, certain that he's killed him.
The bullet grazed the top of his fedora, separating the brim from the body of the hat and causing a graze wound across the side of Costello's skull. Frank put his hand to his head, and he saw the blood, and he later remarked to somebody he thought the bullet might still be in there. Phil Kennedy appeared and hailed a cab, and Kennedy said Roosevelt Hospital and step on it.
The cab driver spoke to reporters the next morning.
Who was in the cab?
Frank, I recognize Frank Costello because the fellow said, Frank, he says, don't worry about it. He says, we're taking him right to the nearest hospital. And so I turned around and I looked and I says, aren't you Frank Costello? And he says, yeah. So I said, mind your own business.
Who said that?
Kennedy.
While doctors treated Costello, a detective found slips in his pockets that showed casino earnings at the Tropicana, evidence of the mob's hold on Vegas. Evidence that would come back to haunt Costello in his tax evasion case. When the cops questioned Costello after his release from the hospital, he refused to tell them who had fired the bullet that nearly killed him. "I don't know who could have done it," Costello maintained. "I haven't an enemy in the world." Vincent Gigante went into hiding, but turned himself into police a month later.
Vinny, did you give yourself up because you were afraid?
No, you're crazy.
Costello knew that Vito Genovese was behind the shooting, but Costello did not want to go to war.
When he got shot in the head, he literally said, "Why do I need these headaches?" Rather than start a war and tear apart this mob, these families that I worked so hard to put together, to bind together, to have diplomacy among, I would rather step out, relinquish my own power, than to tear this apart.
Costello demonstrated his loyalty to the mob, even when it involved the man who had tried to kill him. At Giganti's trial, Frank refused to identify him. Giganti was found not guilty.
Giganti walked across the courtroom, stuck out his hand, said, "Thanks, Frank," and Frank Costello took it. I think this was Costello's way of saying to Genovese, "All right, I'm alive, I'll move out, you're now the new leader," and it was his way of making a public resignation.
Even though Frank had retired from the mob, Genovese was still suspicious of him and his closest ally and street muscle, Albert Anastasia. On October 25, 1957, at the Park Sheraton Hotel, as Anastasia leaned back in a barber's chair for his morning shave, Vito's henchmen gunned him down. Back at the Majestic, Costello's attorney found his client with Anastasia's brother. They were sobbing. Costello said, "This means I'm next." Before that could happen, a court reaffirmed Costello's conviction for tax evasion. The Prime Minister was shipped back to prison to finish out his sentence. Vito Genovese was about to join him there, bringing their lifelong feud to prison and nearly causing a riot. In 1959, Frank Costello brokered the most important deal of his life. He had spent a year in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary when his bitter rival, Vito Genovese, became his fellow inmate. Genovese had been convicted of drug trafficking and sentenced to 15 years. Their feud threatened to escalate into a full-out prison war. Costello arranged a prison sit-down with Genovese and worked out a truce. True to form, the Prime Minister had set aside his true feelings for Genovese in order to play the diplomat.
He hated Genovese, though. He said, "That son of a," he says, "he tried to put me down. You try to put me down, you better put me down."
Costello got the ultimate revenge. Genovese would die behind bars a decade later. Costello's sentence, on the other hand, came to an end on June 30th, 1961, but he still faced a deportation hearing.
Frank, during those years in Atlanta, did you sit around making plans, do a lot of thinking?
I'm always thinking.
About what, Frank?
How do you feel about this deportation thing, going back to Italy?
Well, I don't want to make no comments on it now, especially you understand.
Would you rather remain in this country?
Naturally, I would.
And if you stay, what do you plan to do?
I'm retired.
Costello would not have to go back to Italy after all. The U.S. Supreme Court threw out the deportation order against him. Costello resumed holding court at the Waldorf, where new mob leaders like Charlie the Blade Tureen would seek his advice. The Prime Minister picked up a new moniker he cherished, Uncle Frank.
He was pretty much off the police radar screen because they knew he was inactive. He had made his fortune, and he had hidden his money, and he really didn't need to work. And I think he was, living the waning years of the sportsman's life.
Frank relaxed at his Long Island estate. He cultivated roses, which he entered in local competitions. As always, Costello preferred socializing with people outside the mob, like the actor Anthony Quinn.
That's the main thing about Frank. I don't think he didn't want to tell me about that. I was, and one day I was riding in the back of the truck, and there's and the gun went. He didn't want to talk about that. He wanted to find new horizons, new vistas.
In New York, Costello remained a celebrity and a living legend based on his criminal past. Author Peter Moss approached Frank to write a biography.
I said, "You want to leave your here footprints in the sand of time." He liked that. Then I said, "I think this is so important I think I get the biggest advance anybody has gotten for a non-fiction book. And I did. He never asked for a penny.
Moss and Costello met 11 times, the first 7 occasions in Moss's apartment.
Everybody knew who he was. When he left the apartment, I walked downstairs and the doorman turned around to me and said, he said, there's the real Godfather.
After a year and a half of discussions, Costello finally consented to writing his biography with Moss. But just 10 days later, on February 18, 1973, the author got bad news.
Charlie the Blade Tureen called me and he just said, he's gone, and hung up the phone. I didn't have to ask who.
Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the underworld, had died of a heart attack.
At the age of 82, he had found himself. He could say, I know what it means now to be alive, with all its responsibilities and problems. Still, I've earned a good night's sleep.
In keeping with Costello's last wishes, his funeral was a small affair. Only 50 mourners, most of whom had nothing to do with the Mafia. He was buried at St. Michael's Cemetery in Queens. As the priest gave a short prayer, his wife Bobby and her brother paid their last respects. Even in his grave, Costello made headlines. A year after his death, an explosion rocked his mausoleum. A mobster named Carmine Galante was behind the bombing. He had just gotten out of prison for narcotics and was about to take over as boss of the Bonanno crime family.
This was his message, saying, all the old bets are off. And Frank Costello was the very symbol of the old bosses. He was the symbol of the old ways that shunned dealing narcotics, that said there was a certain code. And this was Galante's way of spitting in the face of the old ways.
But as time went by, the mob faced greater scrutiny from law enforcement and more internal strife. Frank Costello's reign as boss would come to be seen as a golden era.
I don't think there will ever be another sitting boss who can meet with judges and political bosses and have the kind of unbridled influence. That's something that happened under Frank Costello in New York for just one era.
He is certainly the only major figure in the mob who I believe could have been a huge success legitimately. You keep hearing, how smart they are if they'd only taken another road. He's the only one I ever met.
He once said in so many words that I'm about gaining wealth, power, influence. And I'm engaged in taking wealth, power, and influence away from those who already have it. By his lights, gangland was the only way that he could do this. And by his lights, he succeeded.